Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here again for the second year. Before I get started in talking about our grant, I want to first acknowledge my collaborators, as well as a collaborator we picked up along the way, which is my grad student, Max Bronte. He did a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today. So our goals with the grant were to first identify moral exemplars using a battery of psychological assessments and other tools. And then we wanted to describe these individuals both in terms of maybe the psychological processes that explain their moral exceptionality, as well as potential costs and benefits of being a moral exemplar. So kind of very similar to John's work. We defined a moral exemplar, though, as somebody who essentially just maintains a moral compass. We felt like that this type of individual was someone who is actually exceptional. So this is somebody who frequently and consistently engages in moral acts in their daily life, and this is independent of the magnitude of those acts. So I give the example, if you were to give 25 cents to a homeless person every day, you'd be considered a moral exemplar in our study rather than giving them $1,000 once, as an example. So we feel like the utility of this definition is that these small acts that happen every single day probably have a large impact on society. And if the goal of this endeavor is in fact to lift everyone's moral character up just a bit, it's a little bit easier target to hit than these grandiose major acts of running to a burning building or whatever we want to call moral. The other feature of our definition is we are basically relying on these moral virtues to describe morality in this case, so things like fairness and loyalty and so on. All right. So, similar to John, we had this idea of doing an online pre-sampling study where we were going to have nearly 1,000 people from Toronto and Montreal describe themselves online. And in addition to describing themselves, they're also going to nominate up to 6 informants or individuals who knew them quite well, hopefully from different social contexts. So after we have this large sample, what they're going to do is describe their basic virtuous tendencies. So you can think of like personality traits, how moral are you in general. And we also wanted them to describe their moral behavior. So the targets would describe their moral behavior several times a day for up to a week. And the people who knew them really well, the 6 informants, would describe them once a day when they actually interact with them that day. So this way you can get kind of their general behaviors as well as their overall personality traits. And based on this type of assessment, we wanted to identify what we consider the top 20%, these would be our moral exemplars, and bring them into the lab. This is our red tulip group, those would be our moral exemplars. Bring them into the lab to assess them, as well as a control group of about the same size that were not in that top 20%. So once we identified this group, our goal was to then bring people into the lab for a variety of assessments to understand more about their moral character. So in particular, we wanted to see how do they actually behave in the lab on these kind of common moral tasks or in-lab behaviors. What is their personality like, potentially things on like the Moral Foundations questionnaire. And then in terms of processes that might explain how they're able to be moral exemplars, we're interested in a variety of cognitive processes that might facilitate that moral process, as well as emotional processes. And then in terms of potential outcomes or pros and cons associated with being a moral exemplar, we wanted to look at a variety of social outcomes as well as general well-being. Okay, so that was our plan. One big adjustment we made, maybe early on in the process, we realized the best way to get high quality data is actually to bring everyone into the lab rather than assess people online. So one of our big concerns was that the informant participation rate might be weak, or we might not get valid data unless we actually meet people and see them in the lab and get that assessment in person. So we shifted our priorities. Instead of doing this first large online sample and then bringing everyone in, we actually kind of did what John was suggesting might be a good secondary sample. Maybe we can share our data and bring people all into the lab first rather than doing that online screening. So what I'm going to show you are some in-progress findings based on this different paradigm that we developed. So in a nutshell, what it's going to look like is participants come in at time 1 to fill out their self-reports on a battery of questionnaires. They also do the variety of those cognitive tasks that I was talking about. So this isn't a self-report, it's like actual IQ tests, things like that. And then over the course of 1 to 3 weeks, around time 2, they would come back into the lab and do those behaviors, those in-lab moral tasks, things like that. And then we would get a variety of social outcomes because they actually interact with group members. So people they've never met before, that we see how they actually interact with peers. And in their interim, we get informant reports, and they do experience sampling, meaning they describe themselves throughout the course of the day for about a week. All right. So of course, the big endeavor is to try to identify who our moral exemplars are so that we can see what people are like in different groups. So I'm going to talk about 3 groups similar to John. I don't have morally dark and light. I'm going to have basically our non-exemplars, way over to the left, our little devils there. And then we kind of have our average Joe, which is in the middle. It's going to be our average person, the moral character. And then our moral exemplars will be over to the right. And basically, what I'm going to do is find in our sample these kind of cutoffs of 20 percentiles and just show you descriptively what people might look like if they're in these different categories of morality. Right. Now, to do so, I'm going to start off with this general assumption that when you fill out a self-report measure, what we're actually trying to capture is this underlying thing in you that we're going to call moral character. In this case, your self-reported moral character. So how we actually do this is we ask you to describe yourselves in a variety of adjectives. But our basic assumption is that the underlying moral character in you is causing you to say that you're high on all these different virtues and tendencies. So we're making an assumption that looks kind of like this. This is the latent model that we're talking about. And we have some evidence that there's actually, this fits quite well, and that people's moral character can be described in this way. When people say that they're cooperative, trustworthy, or so on, it's capturing this underlying, what we're going to call moral trait. We get the same kind of model if we assume that your reputation has the same kind of structure. When people describe your reputation, if they describe you on cooperative, trustworthy, and so on, that they are calling to mind your overall moral virtue in their mind. This is your reputation, or I'm calling social reality, because this is based on the aggregate of many informants describing you. So it's not just one person, it's what people think about you in general. So similar to John, our goal is to come up with one score, not have 2 different scores, but one overall score that would describe your moral character that we could use to put people into these 3 different bins. So here we're just trying to see to what extent does a model capture your overall moral character from the self's perspective and from informant's perspective of you. So unfortunately, this model had horrible fit, rejected on all levels. And basically, one of the big reasons is that the factor was essentially just defined by informant reports. So the self-reports really weren't predicted at all from this overall moral character. And some of you might be thinking, well, that's because you use aggregate of peer reports, so like the peers are outnumbering the self, and this still holds up even if you use just one peer report. So it's not the aggregation principle, it's just more defined by informant reports than by self-reports. So we thought, okay, well, maybe one reason this is happening is that when people describe themselves, we are all kind of, we have this tendency to maybe think we're good at everything, maybe. So there might be some response tendencies in the data that are kind of clouding the picture of our moral factor. So we decided to try to pull out some of the variants that might be due to the way people describe themselves just in general in questionnaires, these positive bias factors. So to do that, we created a new bias factor just for self-perceptions, and it's captured down here. And conceptually what this is saying is that if you say you're somebody who's attractive and intelligent and funny and moral, as much as you might believe that that's the case, chances are you're probably not high on all of those things. What you're actually measuring here is just positivity. You just think you're good at everything. So we have controlled for that. We pulled a variance out of that positivity bias. But we also know that sometimes our informants, they love us. They took the time to do this questionnaire about us. Like, they might also have rose-colored glasses and to see us in globally positive ways, even though that might not reflect reality. So we're also pulling out the bias due to that variance as well in this model. So again, we're purifying the biases of self-reported biases and informant-reported biases to try to get a cleaner measure of your overall moral character, what is just unique to moral attributes and not this positivity bias. So that model fit really well, as most bi-factor models do. However, we still get the same problem. The self-report still isn't really being predicted by this particular model, even if we use a single informant. So what we were stuck with is the problem of having not one type of moral exemplar, but 2. So we're going to have to deal with the fact that there might be self-reported moral exemplars as well as other reported moral exemplars. This type of model fit the data best and probably best describes these types of reports. There was a correlation between self-reported moral character and informant-reported moral character. It was weak to moderate. And if you don't control for this bias, it actually goes down a little bit. So I think the bias is actually helping us. Removing the bias is helping us a bit. OK, so this is what I'm going to use to actually describe people's moral character. And what we've done is like export these scores so that each person has a score. You can be high on this factor or low on this factor for self-reported morality, or high or low on informant-reported morality. And this would be a gist of what the distributions look like if it's self-reported or informant-reported. And so our goal is basically to divvy up this distribution into 20%. The bottom 20% here will be our non-exemplars. Then we have our average Joes in the middle. And then we have our moral exemplars off to the right. So you can get a sense of the group size we're dealing with. So keeping in mind we're still collecting data. This is going to be preliminary results, what we have so far. Now, some of you might be wondering, like, are there super exemplars, people who are high on both? Like, clearly you must be capturing a lot of those. And it turns out that even when you have this criteria of 20%, there's only 7 people who say that they're a moral exemplar, basically, and are actually seen by others as being a moral exemplar. If you push the criterion to the top 5%, there's just 1 person. So what I'm going to do is show you what these individuals might look like on the variety of characteristics I talked about. Partly this will be descriptive. If you see a star, it means it's statistically different, that those exemplars are actually higher than the other groups. But we'll get a just sense of what they're like, these exemplars. And the other thing is, I'll just show you the super exemplars just for fun, but I'm not making claims about if they're higher or lower than anyone. It's just to demonstrate what they're like. Okay. So these are the characteristics that I'll be talking about: the behavior, social outcomes, well-being, and so on. And I think we should first start off with actual behavior. What are people doing when they show up to the lab and engage in moral tasks? In this study, what we did is we relied on 2 pretty common games when it comes to assessing moral character. For those of you that don't know, I'd be surprised if there's anyone who doesn't know the public goods game. We gave people $20 in Monopoly money, and we're like, hey, listen, there's this community chest, a little chest here. You're going to put money in that chest, and basically after you do that, after everyone in the group does that, we're going to divvy it up and give it all back to everyone in equal amounts. However, that pool is going to be doubled, or like, multiplied by 2.5, something like that. So it's in your best interest to put money in that pot because you'll get money overall back if everyone cooperates. But you could be a freeloader and not give any money and just get a lot of money back, basically, if other people are following this rule. And the other thing here is a charity donation. Here we say, if you could donate some money to the charity of your choice, which charity would that be? How much would you actually donate? So I'll talk about the public goods game first. This is just the overall amount that they contributed to the community chest. I centered it within group just to control for that some groups might have been more or less cooperative. So what you'll see first is that these dotted lines are always a 95% confidence interval around a particular value, in this case the average. And we'll first see our non-exemplars. I have self-reported always to the left and other reported to the right. So these are the people that are the lowest on our factor. And then we have our average Joes are going to be in the middle. They're the brown bars. And then we have what we're all waiting for, our moral exemplars right here. So in this case, it looks like our self-reported exemplars tended to give more on average than the other groups, although this wasn't statistically significant difference. We only had 1 person that was our super exemplar out of the 7 do this task, and they actually gave less. Sorry. But on average, our moral exemplars gave more. Now, for the charity donation, so again, I'm giving you the 95% confidence interval around the average. These were our non-exemplars, kind of average there. Our average Joes, a little below average in one category. Here are moral exemplars. So they actually seem to give self-reported moral exemplars a little bit more than average. And our 1 participant, even though they gave less in that community chest, when it comes to their charity, they're giving it all. So the top amount was $40, and they pretty much maxed out the scale of how much they could give in the donation part of the study. So far from behavior, at least, we're looking at self-reported moral exemplars seem to at least give more on average when it comes to these games or these tasks in the lab. Moving to some cognitive features that might explain how these people have these exemplary traits, we considered 3 possible cognitive attributes that might matter. One is IQ. Maybe people who have higher mental horsepower just can process moral dilemmas and more readily. I have CRT here. This is a cognitive reflexive task. It's basically, are you an intuitive thinker? You just kind of go with your gut, or are you very rational and logical and need to process your decisions a little bit more? And then self-control is exactly that, self-reported self-control. Okay. So just starting with intelligence, again, these are the confidence intervals around the average. Our non-exemplars, our average Joes, and then here are our moral exemplars. It looks like when it comes from an other person's perspective, these types of moral exemplars are actually more intelligent than on average. We see an asterisk. It was actually a significant difference in the groups. But when we look at our super exemplars, they're just about average. Okay. When it comes to self-control, again, our average, this is our non-exemplars, average Joes, And then here are our exemplars. Again, self-reported exemplars are telling you that they have a large or high level of self-control, more than average, as are our super exemplars. And then finally, when it comes to that, whether you're a rational or intuitive thinker, this is going to be the scores for the CRT. Now, the lower the score is, the more you're just an intuitive, go with your gut kind of thinker. The higher the score, the more rational or deliberate you are in your thinking. So first, with our non-exemplars, looks like self-reported, they're a little bit more logical, rational. Here are average Joes. And then when it comes to our moral exemplars, they were significantly more intuitive than the other groups when it was self-reported moral exemplar traits. Sorry, as was our super exemplars. Okay, so to wrap up the cognitive characteristics, it seems that at least when other people think that we're moral exemplars, we also seem to have higher IQ. When it comes to the CRT and self-control, these are associated with the self-reported moral exemplar traits. So moving to social outcomes. So here what we're interested in is, to what extent are these people high in popularity? Do they have status? Are they people who are respected? Are they seen as having social skills? Or are they just like sticks in the mud that nobody really likes because they're consistently moral and kind of boring? All right. So what I'm going to do is first show you results for liking and popularity. They're similar constructs first. I have S and O. Self is going to be self-reported moral traits. O is going to be other reported moral traits. And just to remind you that we're looking at red bars, it's our non-exemplars, brown is our average Joes, and blue is our exemplars. So starting off with liking, again, our average amount, our confidence intervals around the average. We see that basically we have our non-exemplars, our Joes, and our moral exemplars. No matter which report you're looking at, they seem to be liked more on average, as our super exemplars are. When we look at popularity, it seems similar to liking, but popularity does have a bit of status kind of included in that definition, so it's a little bit different than just liking. And we see actually a slightly different finding where it's just other reports of moral exceptionality predicts higher rates of popularity here. Moving to respect and status, we get a very similar finding to liking. People who describe themselves as being moral exemplars or who are seen as moral exemplars seem to have more respect on average. However, when it comes to status, it was just other reports of moral exemplary traits that predicted higher status. The same effect for status was shown for being socially skilled as well, so I'm not repeating that graph, but basically socially skilled looked the same as status. So again, to wrap this up, the characteristics of moral exemplars when it comes to social outcomes, if basically you're seen by your peers as being a moral exemplar, they think you're awesome on all levels, you're liked, you have status, you have social skills, and so on. But it was just liking and respect that was related to the self-reported moral exemplars. For well-being, this is basically defined as to the degree to which you're happy, satisfied with life, you have high self-esteem, and you're not depressed, kind of a subscale of those items, overall gist of your psychological well-being. This is our confidence intervals around the mean. We have our non-exemplars, our average Joes, and again, our exemplars. No matter who is describing the individual, they're actually higher in well-being, as was our super exemplars. And then finally, just looking at personality, we have a lot of personality assessments in the data set, but I thought I'd focus on the moral foundations, as we've already talked about. John's described what these are, so I won't reiterate those things. But we were looking at all 5 individually to see how people scored across the board. So this will be an intense graph, but we're going to start off with the self and other along the bottom. And again, these are all the means around what you typically see. So before I even show you anything, it's kind of replicating what John found, that there's this tendency to kind of score higher on the fairness and care than the other 3 foundations. When we look at self-reported moral exemplars, they're going to tell you that they really value fairness, but the other reports aren't really going to predict that at all. However, when it comes to care, you get either one basically is going to show that if you value care, you're going to be seen as a moral exemplar, or you're going to see yourself as one as well. For the rest, we see that loyalty, it's just self-reported moral exemplars that predicts higher values of loyalty. Purity, nothing seems to matter. And then for authority, again, also self-reports only. All right, so that was a lot. Let's sum up. So if you are telling us that you're a moral exemplar, just self-reported moral exemplar, who are you? So according to what we found so far with the data that we have, it means that when you come into the lab, you're going to probably be more giving on moral tasks. It means that you're going to tell us that you value all of the moral virtues except for purity, basically. You're going to be high in well-being. You're going to have high self-esteem. You're satisfied with your life, and so on. You're going to be liked and respected by your peers. And you're going to be high in self-reported self-control. And you're going to be more of an intuitive kind of thinker. If other people say you're a moral exemplar, what might you look like? You're also going to be high in well-being. You're going to be high in every possibly wonderful social attribute you could have, liked, respected, socially skilled, so on. You're going to say that you value care, and you're also going to be higher in IQ. If we want to think about what are the patterns when we only have effects for self and other reports, we just get 3 things. So basically, you're someone who values care, you're high in well-being, and you're liked and respected. This would be our moral exemplars, no matter which perspective you're looking at. It shows up for both types of perspectives. So some analyses to come. One of the most important ones in my mind is looking at the experience sampling data to get what people's behaviors are like on a daily basis, as well as we have coded behavior, what's going on in the lab, to get a better sense of more moral behaviors than just a couple that we're able to look at in the lab. For cognitive attributes, we have more objective tasks called a flanker. It's not a self-reported self-control task, but it's more of a task-based self-control task. So we can see if our effects for self-control replicate there, as well as an actual creativity task. For social outcomes, we can actually test the degree to which moral exemplars see other people with filters or not. Do they see other people as being especially moral or not? And do they use cues differently than the average person when judging personality of others? The other one is emotion. So my colleague Lauren Human specializes in physiological measurements, and she's going to be looking at reactivity. Are these people who are especially reactive in the lab? Are they more able to adapt to their environments? And finally, some objective measures of well-being, more like health. However, similar to John, we had some issues that we dealt with respect to measurement, and I want to talk to you about some of our thoughts and get your opinion as to how we can maybe solve those problems in our data or other data sets that are struggling with that issue. The big one is low congruence, right? So we have self-reports, informant reports, and actual behavior. And our goal ultimately was to imagine the situation that's ideal like this. So you have some overlap in the middle, and you can basically tap into that middle and say, this is morality, that what everybody's opinions are converging on is someone's actual moral character, and use something like that to actually see what the morally virtuous might actually look like. And instead you get something more like this, where things are less overlapping, right? So the strongest correlation I could find in the data, this isn't looking at the group differences, but just a correlation between what people say about themselves and what they do, was 0.17. That was the biggest one, totally p-hacking to find the biggest effect. And then for other reports, are also a weak predictor of actual behavior. So we want to basically figure out how can we get measures that actually converge to some degree. I want to point out this is not unique to morality. You get the same effect whenever you're trying to use self and other reports and try to predict a specific behavior in other domains. An example is intelligence. So with our data set, we actually replicated an effect that my old advisor found with IQ. If you want to know how smart someone is in terms of how they're going to perform on an IQ test, you don't ask them, you ask their friends. And we found the same thing here, that basically friend reports of intelligence predicted IQ tests and self-reports didn't. So I don't think it's unique to morality. It's something that we have to think about in general. And I think one of the things that might be driving this issue is granularity. So our self and other measures are basically very broad dimensions of traits or attributes, but our behaviors are very narrow specific instances. And so we have this different level of granularity. We're trying to capture something very tiny with something very big, basically. So I'm hoping that when we do our analyses with the ESM behaviors, that we can start to make the granularity about the same level, kind of an overall snapshot view of your behavior over many days, looking much more like a trait that we're trying to measure with self and informant reports, or look at more in lab behaviors in general. The other measurement issue to think about is complexity. The way we see ourselves, I think, is much more complex than the way other people see us. So I'm putting up a picture here again of that factor that I tried to fit, a single factor, right? And the self-reports were not at all really predicted by that factor. It was just informant reports. And sometimes with this type of modeling, what that means is that when we see ourselves on attributes like trustworthiness and loyalty and honesty and things like that, we're making distinctions among each of those attributes. We're not thinking we're overall moral or not. We make fine distinctions among each of those virtues. Whereas when other people describe us, they just think that we're kind of all good or maybe not, right? So we're trying to fit a model where there's just different levels of complexity, and they're never really going to fit that well. So to get a snapshot view of what might be going on with our data, what I'm going to show you is just a visualization of a correlation matrix. So not the correlations, but just kind of the size of what they might be. So here basically on this left side, we have just self-reports. And you can't see the words, and that's fine. It's not important. It's just all the adjectives people use to describe their moral virtue. So things like loyalty, honest, fair, so on. The strongest, darkest box is basically telling you that's the biggest correlation. That if you think you're trustworthy, you're also going to say you're loyal. But otherwise, those correlations aren't necessarily as dark. OK, so this isn't the most important thing. This is just how strong those correlations are in general. The bigger and darker the box, the bigger and stronger the correlation is. Compare that to informant reports. And it's subtle, but they're definitely darker and larger in the informant report correlation matrix, just suggesting that when somebody's rating you, they're just going to say you're kind of high in everything or low in everything. They're not making as many distinctions as you are when you're describing yourself. So I think one big solution to this is actually not creating these large factors that describe morality in general, but to actually go kind of one virtue at a time, measuring one virtue really, really well, rather than trying to assume that people are going to see themselves as overall moral. OK. And then the last thing that comes to mind after doing a study like this, it's extremely intensive in terms of getting multiple behaviors, daily assessments, things like that. And so one thing we've been thinking about is, if our definition is somebody who's consistently and frequently moral, rather than literally testing them frequently and consistently, maybe actually try to come up with situations that are really strong. They're going to push people at their boundary level. Let's see if they're still consistent and frequently moral, even despite this situation. That might be an easier test, maybe a one-off test, rather than measuring people multiple times in daily life. So something like this might be putting people into these situations where other people are defecting a lot in these cooperative games, and you basically have to be that consistent cooperator and stick with it. Are you going to be the person that continues to give despite the fact that other people aren't? And maybe that's what we're trying to get at as well, rather than measuring people every day multiple times that we've been trying to do. OK. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and I'm really looking forward to any feedback you have. And I want to remind you we're still doing data analysis and collection, so any feedback you have might really help us out a lot. So thank you. Questions?
Yeah, so excuse me. I wanted to mention that we see those same kinds of patterns in terms of like the stronger correlations among all of the dimensions from another report versus a self-report.
Yeah.
So just to back you up on that
Thank
point, we see that too. But that sort of bleeds into a concern that we might have with other reports of morality, because it suggests that if someone just thinks that you're cool or skilled,
right,
they're more likely to infer that you're also moral. So that raises potentially a validity issue with other reports of morality.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I thought that controlling for the bias would help us out, that when you control for the positivity bias, you should be getting a more valid measure of people's perceptions of your moral character. So one potential avenue is to test that a little bit further, like, are there other ways we can statistically control for these kind of halo effects to measure the specific variance that's just due to the moral perceptions? But there's also just, if that's a psychological process people use, you're either good or bad, and you're good and bad on all things, that maybe you can't just statistically tease that apart. That's just actually how it is. So that's a really good point. Ideally, like, especially when you have business school types of situations, or like companies where people are very familiar with you but don't necessarily like you, that those are the ideal informants, I think, in some ways, because especially if you just pull from informants who do not like you, like what is your moral character, you might be able to tease out a part of it. But in our sample, there are people who volunteered to describe you, so they're probably very close and liked others. Yeah, thank you very much.
I wasn't quite sure I got that, but it sounded like you were saying that one solution, so the low correlation between self-reporting behaviors had to do was, you were suggesting one solution was the granularity problem, that you're trying to predict a single behavior with a broad personality character.
Not with self and other, okay. With behavior, yes.
Is that right? Is that what you were saying? That the solution would be to assess multiple behaviors rather than just one or two behaviors?
That's what we're hoping, that when we look at our ESM of behavior, that might be a little bit closer to a trait, kind of like your density distributions match on to your trait levels, versus if I just got you in one state, would that actually be the same as your trait? Probably not, so, no. Yeah. But
right, I just want to sort of reiterate the point that, we really can't expect, we know that a single
right,
chance to be moral or not moral is not going to be predicted very strongly from your trait, because there's so many things going on in that particular moment. And so it's important for us to try to build in multiple assessments of behavior into our assessments of morality.
Exactly.
And then we'll probably find the strong relationships.
Exactly.
I do want to make just, David's in the room, I just want to point out that 0.17 actually is strong. It's a strong correlation, but it doesn't come across maybe as strong as you'd hoped. And so and we're going to get 0.17s, I think, between self-reports and behaviors when we just use one or two behaviors.
Exactly.
It's just we're just going to have to accept that as we go forward, trying to really understand behavioral correlates of morality.
That's why I'm, again, with ESM, the most exciting part of our project in our minds is the informant, like ESM. Like, it's still unclear if that's going to really tap in reliably to what people are doing, but exactly for that reason, that you can't rely on the one-off behaviors. And a lot of studies that look like, do people detect trustworthy people just based on a face? They use one task in lab to validate trustworthiness. Like, there's a whole body of literature based on these like one-off validations. So we definitely agree with you that that's not the way to go. But ideally, like you said, it'd be nice to have more convergence, even with self and other. Like 0.22 is not necessarily nothing either, but we would hope to have a little bit more to be able to measure a single factor. Yeah, anyways, sorry.
Just to follow up on that, there's a complementary thing though, that you yourself suggested that I don't think we've tried enough. There used to be a whole debate in the ability literature about whether we should assess average or maximal performance. And maximal performance basically won that argument.
Right.
And we really haven't tried that in personality very often, probably mostly because of ethical kinds of reasons. But this is really a case where you could try to push somebody and see if that boosts the validity even of one shot.
For the strong situation.
Somebody really might need to be exceptional to do this.
Right. I don't know who is next.
I'll go ahead. I'll wait.
Anna?
Well, it's also related to this. Of course, I agree with this discussion on granularity and how self-report matches to behavior. I mean, that's general findings in personality across the last 100 years, I guess.
Yeah.
But I wonder how this matches your definition of moral exceptionality, of being consistently moral. So I think it shouldn't be so much about a mean behavior across games, but it should be across that there shouldn't be much variance in those, like intra-individual variance in those people. There should
No, to be clear, I think the action is going to come with the ESM data. Are they consistently, are they being seen consistently or behaving consistently on a daily basis, and have multiple in-lab assessments of their actual moral behavior? So what I'm showing you is just a general snapshot of what we get with our couple of behaviors in the lab. But you're right, that's not the definition in our mind, that that one-off behavior, what are you going to do? It's, are you consistently someone who does that? So yeah.
But you could think about the same for the behaviors. You're saying that you're capturing more types of behaviors, and so maybe it's not about averaging across all those behaviors, but maybe it's about looking at how consistent people are in their behavior across them.
So do you mean something like there might just be somebody who if you think that giving money to homeless people is moral, that they're just consistently giving money every day, but it wouldn't be all of their behaviors that's consistent, it's just that one virtue? Or do you mean in general?
I mean that for example, if it's a donation, one type of behavior, maybe this consistent person is not the one giving the $38, but giving $1, and is also not contributing the full maximum to the public goods game, but is contributing to it, and so on.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that measuring, again, making the criterion for the exemplar being the behavior we measure outside of the lab. I think what I was showing you today with the behaviors is let's just see what they look like when they come into the lab. That's not the definition consistently and frequently moral. So I'm sorry if that was confusing. So I'm not saying that that's the moral exemplar behavior. Just here's what moral exemplars do when they come into the lab and do this task. This is what they do. Yeah, but I think you're totally right that it could be the $1, but they give it to every single charity donation that they're ever asked to give it to, or something like that. Yeah. I think it was Aranda, and then in the back.
So I really enjoyed your talk. I had a question about you. So at the end of your talk, you talked about how individuals tend to make differences between their traits in subtle ways, whereas informants tend to go black and white. So have you found a similar relationship between self and other reports in the Big Five? Or is it something that you think is distinctive to moral?
I haven't personally looked. I know that past literature has looked at more I don't know if they use a profile approach. I'm sure network analyses people are doing this now, that that when you describe others in general, that it's more condensed like that. I don't think it's just morality. And maybe like a network approach is actually good for this. You can see exactly how tightly everything is connected. But I don't think it's unique to morality. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry, in the back. And then Eric.
So this is coming from way outside the psychology literature. I really like the idea of trying to get at people who are consistently in all the small everyday ways doing that thing. But then I noticed what seemed to me a real disjunct between the qualities that you asked them and others about and the qualities that I would think that I would use to characterize somebody who did do that, notably something like thoughtfulness.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, thoughtfulness is somebody who, you had this picture of somebody holding the umbrella over someone as they, but I can't see any of those where that thoughtfulness or considerateness or kindness or the kinds of things that I would use to describe, that I would reach for that kind of everyday behavior. And I wonder if maybe that's some reason for some of this disjunctiveness.
Right. We will get that with our ESM data. So in the ESM data, they don't just describe moral character, they do just the general big five. You're describing actual traits of like agreeableness and conscientiousness and things like that. So we can see kind of on a daily basis, are these people, again, consistently and frequently being seen as being high on those attributes? What I didn't present today is how these people are seen on the big five. And it seems like moral exemplars from a peer perspective are conscientious and agreeable, basically. So exactly what you're saying, that these people who are thoughtful.
Thoughtfulness, conscientious?
Well, it's not quite. With the considerate and kind and things like that, I would put in probably the agreeableness bin. But it's close to what you're saying. Maybe not literally the word thoughtfulness, but the domain of like, I'm going to kind of be kind and compassionate and things like that would kind of be more in that domain. But we're not capturing like, what did you actually do? So we can't code objectively, was this person doing something that was like that? But we can get other people's perspectives of, was this person in general moral and or high on the big five, things like agreeableness and conscientiousness. Yeah. But yeah, I think it was Eric and then, sorry.
So I have a question about, I'm still stuck on this informant report tendency to see everything either positively or not. And I'm just wondering if you can, either in your data or just conceptually, tease that out somehow in terms of whether you measured sort of how knowledgeable the informant is about the person, or addressing issues of like compartmentalization, whether the person knows the person in lots of different roles, whether some of these indistinct sort of just positive impressions break down a little bit and informants get more expertise on sort of more specific domains.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, again, if they know you but don't necessarily like you, things like that would be one way to tease it apart. My grad student Max is working on measurement models, like I said, to kind of pull out the variance that is just this rose-colored glasses kind of bias. And so one thing I'll definitely pass along to him is just this idea of like try doing across context. Like he's doing it with like people that you just meet, so first impressions versus close others, and we have classroom data, so similar to the MBA, like they're having to work together, but they don't necessarily like each other, so we can kind of see how that kind of halo can change that matrix of correlations. But I think you're probably right that it's kind of probably largely like if I like you, I've decided or I don't like you, you're good or bad, that the liking is what's really doing it. But yeah, it needs to be formally tested, so I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah. Go ahead, Anna.
I wonder whether averaging across really different types of moral behavior would, I think it's in line with your definition of what a moral exemplar person might be, but I still wonder whether it's a realistic idea of how moral persons are to be identified. Because I can imagine that people really choose some contexts in which they are extremely moral. This might depend on, for example, their moral context or moral values, but it's also maybe related to the targets, so that I support some targets more often than others. But it could also be an idea of how efficient people deal with where to invest moral support in a way.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's both could be situational, and I think one reason why we decided to collect all the data rather than do our assessment first and then pull out our exemplars after that is that it might just be that people just specialize in one virtue, for example, so they don't just have an overall moral character, that they just specialize in fairness or they just specialize in compassion, something like that. So it can be that they specialize just in one virtue, or like you're saying that it's very contextual. And that's why I think it might be nice, like David was talking about, coming up with just a strong situation, so that we're not trying to, it's very difficult to capture every single moment of a person's life to answer a question like you're bringing up. Even with the ESM, we're not going to be capturing all of that information. So maybe our best guess is actually to put people at their limit and see what happens on that particular virtue. Yeah, if anyone has any ideas, I'd love to hear how to capture someone in every single context of their life.
What was humility a measurement?
I don't remember.
Some of the issues of self-reporting.
Oh, definitely have narcissism, which is opposite of that. I don't remember. I'm sure we have it. I didn't include it in here, but I'm sure we have it, actually. It's just I don't know if I trust self-reports of humility in the sense of like, you're going to... We tried to actually look at meta-perceptions. This is how you think other people see you to bypass it. So it's like, I wouldn't say I'm all these things, but other people might say, like maybe people are more willing to admit their virtues if they're not like bragging, if they're actually humble, is the definition of humility. But yeah, I don't know. I can definitely look to see if that helps. That's a good idea. I felt like somebody else started, sorry, back here and then down.
I was just going to ask, when they assess those traits, did they only see moral traits, or was moral traits kind of mixed in?
It was embedded. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
It was embedded with other attributes.
It was, oh, okay. Because I was trying to think of like a way where people, like other reports might make more finer grained distinctions between the moral traits themselves. I don't know if like giving them just 5 moral traits alone and just asking them to, I don't know, think about these and the ways they might be even subtly different.
Yeah.
But I could just see if I was assessing someone in all the big 5 traits, say, maybe I would just kind of clump all the agreeableness ones together. Oh, they're a nice person.
Right,
and
right.
kind of rate those all the same way.
They were definitely interspersed among a lot of different items, such as the big 5. You know, one thing that people do in self-reports to bypass some biases is like come up with an example in which you word this trait before you fill it out, like to maybe have informants think about, okay, when did you actually see them be trustworthy, and then fill out that item. But yeah, I'm not really aware of how people bypass that. I saw a hand back here and I lost. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was just wondering whether there might be reason to think that an actual exemplar would be less likely to rate themselves highly on these scales. So I know there are people here who know about this much more than I do, but so in interviews with exemplars, it seems like they seem to hold themselves to a higher standard than they hold others to.
Right.
So in that case, they might think that for them, they're just kind of fulfilling their obligations. But
it just leads to me to the question, we have like this other reported exemplar and the self-reported exemplar. I tend to like have less faith in self-reports in general, so I would say, oh, it's the informant reports that are accurate. It just leaves the question, it's unclear, right? So the informants have these issues, like I think you're good at everything, and then the self-report might be, like you're saying, people who are actually exemplars might be very humble as well by definition and not tell you that they're these attributes. So yeah, I think you're right that that could be a problem in self-reports as well. Yeah, that's a good point.
Do we have time?
Yeah, we've got time for one more question.
Is there anybody else who? Okay, on that. Okay. So I want to sort of put together the intelligence thing too a little bit. So if you look at, intelligence tests are behavioral,
Yeah.
right? I mean, of a kind.
Right.
You actually have to answer the question to do some sort of maximum performance. And if you look at, if you just give one intelligence test to someone, the correlation between that test in sort of self-reported intelligence or another reported intelligence or that test in other tests is going to be like 0.17.
Yeah.
Right, but that's why when you do an intelligence test, it takes 6 hours to really.
Are you sure about the correlation across tests though? Because I feel like there is consistency, like 0.5 over time of like the same. No.
No, I'm talking about when you talk about one part of a test. Like so, if you do like the NBAC part, or the NBAC is correlated like 0.717 with the sort of like category fluency test or something like that, right?
Okay.
But that's why you have to do 6 hours of assessments, or at least
Right.
1 hour of like 30 different behaviors,
Right.
and then average across those behaviors before you can actually get a test, a measure of, or a score of someone's intelligence that you can then correlate with other things like real world success or like self-reports of IQ or other reports of IQ and things like that. And I think we really, it's weird that we're holding morality and personality to the standard that it should be able to predict a single test, where we've quite accepted when you test things like IQ, you need to have multiple behavioral tests before you can really assess it. And I think that just really drives home, the value of having the multiple behavioral tests when you're.
Do you think it's historical because like our job was to do like job performance, or like we're supposed to actually identify outcomes? So it might just be a historical reason that we're stuck in this idea like one-off behaviors is what we're supposed to predict.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's not you. I'm sort of agreeing
no,
with
I'm
you.
saying.
We as a field, we're sort of stuck in that
Yeah.
idea. Yeah.
And I think the granularity issue, everyone's pushing more for dynamic things like your model and things like that. It can't just be a general trade. Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you.